During World War II inside of France, there were many people who collaborated with the German army and the Nazi forces during the occupation. Some did this to try and give themselves the best chance of survival, but when the country was liberated, there were huge amounts of public punishments brought to shame those who did collaborate, and there were also scores of executions for treason. In fact, from 1944 until 1951, there were over 6,700 people sentenced to death for treason and other offences, mostly the crime of national degradation, bringing shame to France, but only around 800 executions were carried out. There were women who were also forced to undergo the ugly carnival, where their heads were shaved and they were then covered in Nazi symbols and forced to run the gauntlet, being beaten in the streets. But just days after the liberation of Paris in 1944, there were 6 collaborators who were brought out to the foothills of the French Alps, and they were then tied to a stake before they were ruthlessly shot by a firing squad. These men were members of the Milice, and the French resistance brutally brought their lives to an end. But what is the story of their execution? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Following the liberation of France, there were huge scores of executions carried out upon those people who had helped the German armed forces in any way during the invasion of the nation or during the occupation. It wasn't just soldiers and men who had fought who were considered collaborators, but women who slept with them were, as mentioned, publicly humiliated, and there were also many people who engaged in the black market who were also looked down upon, seen as profiteering from the war. The Provisional Government of the French Republic, which was established and set up, quickly brought order and many collaborators to courts. Some of the most high-profile charged with treason include Philippe Pétain, the former head of the Vichy France, and Pierre Laval, the former Prime Minister of France, who would later be executed. One group who were targeted especially for execution during the fighting of the Second World War by the French resistance were the Milice. This was a political paramilitary group created by the Vichy French regime, along with the Germans to fight the French resistance. They were French people fighting against those forces attempting to liberate them, and the former head of the group was Pierre Laval, with the chief of operations and their de facto leader being Joseph Darnand. The Milice included members of the French far-right parties, and some had actually joined as their families had been killed in Allied bombing raids, or they'd been attacked by members of the French resistance earlier. There were incentives for men to join the Milice, including regular pay, better food rations and employment, and it's believed that by 1944 there were around 30,000 militia men fighting for them. They were identifiable by their distinct blue uniform and also their blue beret. The Milice would carry out summary executions and assassinations of French resistance members, and they were also involved in rounding up those people who were being persecuted by the Nazis, and these men, women and children were then sent on to concentration camps. They were extreme in their actions, and also used brutal torture to extract information from subjects about resistance plans and activities, and they were also seen in the eyes of the resistance as a more dangerous enemy than even the Gestapo or the SS, because of the deep local knowledge of the people they had and the areas they were operating within. But as France was liberated following the D-Day landings, and in the weeks after this, the French resistance put many people to the sword, especially those in the Milice. On the 2nd of September 1944, a series of public executions were carried out against members of the Milice who had been captured by the French resistance. This took place in Grenoble, at the foot of the French Alps, and soldiers of the resistance organisation, the Maquis, had gathered together to execute 6 members of the Milice, men who had worked specifically for the local police department of the Vichy government. The executions were wholly public, and they took place in front of a brick factory, in the very same place where 23 members of the resistance had previously been executed by the Germans. This place was symbolically chosen for the execution. The crowds began to gather at the execution site, and it was said by a witness that they were like rushing to watch a circus, laughing and greeting loudly, and rushing to surround the execution site. At the site, people pushed past each other to find a good view. There was a significant degree of anger inside of France, and after living for years under Nazi occupation, many wanted to see reprisals for the crimes of the Germans and especially those French people who had betrayed them. The 6 men were all brought out to the execution posts outside of the factory, and they were then secured to the stake after having their arms and legs secured to the wooden post so they could not move. It was said of the executions that the 6 dying men walked straight to the execution post without any begging or resistance, then turned around, leaned against a post, and obediently let McKee tie them up. The youngest prisoner was only 19 years old, and the oldest was 26 years old. The 2 youngest were tied to the posts at both ends. They were by no means heroes. They had opposed France, and some of them were still firing back on the day of the liberation. But no one denied that they would also face death. They did not kneel, sigh, or avoid the muzzles of the firing squad. Many of the men who were executed did look very young, possibly in their early 20s, and one of them was 19 years old. It was said of this execution on the post that I paid a special attention to the 19-year-old boy. He was looking up at the sky, just above the firing squad. However, he would never feel the rain again, nor would he see the beautiful Alps above the town. He stood there until the firing squad suddenly opened fire without any signal. The bullets seemed to have entered the chest and heart of the deceased, but I'm not sure. The shooting was carried out twice. The boy leaned forward and fell back against a pillar, never to look up at the sky again. The firing squad was stood not very far away from their targets, the 6 Milice men, and they raised their rifles up, and without order, took a deadly shot. They were, as mentioned, actually ordered to shoot twice into the Milice men, to ensure that death was most probably confirmed. It was then said by the witness that, at that moment, the 5 bodies to the north of me fell down slowly in a terrifyingly neat pattern. The other boy was still standing there. He seemed to be tied tightly to the pillar. His back was straight, but his head was nodding towards the executioner in front of him. The men had all been shot by 2 bullets, but there was one more to come. An officer would approach the bodies to offer a final coup de grace gunshot to the head. It was said of this finishing blow that the moment after the execution seemed to be frozen in time. Then Maquis officers strode to the execution post and shot each prisoner in the head with a pistol. At that time the boy closest to me almost fell to the ground, his hands, which were not untied, hanging onto the post without touching the ground. The next 4 fell under the post. The boy farthest away also began to slide down slowly. A minute after the officer's inspection, the prisoner's body became cold, and his hands were finally untied from the post. People lifted 6 flat coffins from the truck, which looked like they were made from pine wood. After this, they were packed inside of the coffins, which were then taken through the streets, and the French people rushed towards them, screaming abuse at the remains of the 6 men who had just been executed. The executions of the members of the Milice that took place that day in Grenoble captured the feeling amongst the French population against those men who had helped the German forces. They were incredibly angry against those who had betrayed their nation, deeming them as traitors, and these executions were just 6 of many that were carried out during the Second World War and after, dealing with members of the Milice and those who had sold out their nation to collaborate with the Nazis. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.